evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on a miserable night. I think it's gotten a bit wet and cold. My name is Joe Houlihan. I run the Military History Talks here with some colleagues, one of whom is here tonight, I'm pleased to say. I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, Mike Nicholas, who's done two really interesting talks on the Zulu War for us before. So he's concluding the story tonight. We had a fascinating talk about the Battle of Ulundi, which went rather badly for the British, and then the famous siege at Rorke's Drift, which gave us the film Zulu, and Mike was able to tell us what really happened. Tonight's talk will take us to the end of the Anglo-Zulu War, which was a short but really very violent campaign. Without further ado, I'll hand over to tonight's speaker, Mike. Thank you.
Okay, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to extend a warm welcome to this talk, and thank you so much for joining me tonight, particularly in the bad weather. The Battle of Ulundi is a subject that I'm really proud to share with you. Whether you are familiar with this topic or it is something completely new to you, I hope we can go through it together, and hopefully there's something new for everyone in this. So, without further ado, let's get into it. It was now 2:40 p.m. on the 1st of June 1879, and the air was oven hot. The British patrol had already covered 15 miles, but their search was very much in vain. Nothing moved and nothing stirred. Through the shimmering haze, every hill, every bush and tree was distorted and blurred beyond recognition. If the enemy was out there, they stood little chance of seeing them. They arrived at a small homestead belonging to a Zulu lesser chief by the name of Soboza. The Zulu guide was sent in first to make sure that the homestead was clear. And after a quick search, it was quickly deemed safe. Like so many others, Soboza and his family had gone into hiding to avoid entanglements with British patrols. The patrol dismounted their horses and they sought shade from the blazing sun. As some of the patrol rested, Corporal J. Grubb observed that fresh peelings of enthe, a local sugarcane, were lying on the ground close to one of the huts. And he suddenly felt a bit of unease, to put it mildly. Someone had clearly been there pretty recently, and yet no one else seemed overly alarmed by this discovery, nor did they seem to consider the tactical issues that this homestead presented. Hemmed in by long grass on three sides, the entrance was more open. Less than 100 yards away was a watercourse, or a donga, which had been partially filled by recent downpours. This donga was hidden and could not be seen by the homestead's new inhabitants. Despite these issues, the patrol was relaxed and no lookouts were posted. It was now 3:20 p.m. Lieutenant Jaleel Kerry, an experienced officer, took the opportunity to survey the site. He saw absolutely nothing. But the truth is, they were the ones being observed. For more than an hour, their enemy had watched their every move, and this hidden threat was preparing to make its move. A single shot suddenly grazed past the patrol, taking them completely by surprise. This was soon followed by a volley of rifle fire. At that moment, 40 Zulu warriors emerged from the tall grass on the southern side of the homestead. As the patrol got to their feet, Lieutenant Kerry recalled, "My eyes fell upon a number of black faces rushing through the grass behind the troopers. I saw the puffs of smoke, heard the volley fired into us, and saw the Zulus rush forward with a shout. They were about 20 yards off. There was then a general rush. The sudden noise sent the horses into a complete panic. Some of the patrol had managed to mount their horses before the stampede. Others were not so lucky. Amongst this unfortunate group was the leader of the patrol, Louis Napoleon. He was the only son of Napoleon III, the deposed Emperor of France. Unable to mount his horse Tommy, Louis was forced to run alongside the fleeing animal in the hope that he could vault into the saddle. The horse refused to stop, forcing Louis to hold on to the stirrup leather and a pistol holster. The Zulu were advancing quickly, and they were closing fast. About 20 warriors had broken off from the main group and were advancing on the western and eastern flanks of the homestead, attempting to cut off the fleeing patrol. With Louis still clinging precariously to the near side of Tommy, the horse had cleared approximately 50 to 60 yards of open ground before encountering the rough ground around the donga. Through a combination of uneven ground, the destabilizing and lurching effect of a man, and the speed of the horse, the stitching on the saddle began to give way. Under unbearable strain, the stitching finally gave out, and Louis tumbled to the ground. And according to a Zulu account, he hit the ground so hard that his body bounced back upwards, striking Tommy in the belly. As he did so, the horse kicked him in the stomach, badly winding him, and his right arm was also trampled, rendering it inoperable. A group of 7 to 8 Zulu were now 20 yards away, and as Louis struggled for breath, he leveled his revolver at the nearest Zulu. His first shot missed, and was rewarded by a spear striking him in the chest or the left shoulder. We can't be too sure. He would fire another shot, missing again. Another spear struck the Prince Imperial, forcing him to withdraw into the donga. A Zulu warrior then appeared above him to the right. Another spear sailed down, this time embedding itself in Louis's thigh. Either through pulling it out, or the spear having fallen from the wound, it was now in Louis's left hand. He was able to fend off further attacks for a few seconds more. Succumbing to blood loss and then tripping, Louis fell backwards. It was then that the Zulu rushed him. The Prince Imperial was stabbed 18 times, and in accordance with Zulu spiritual practice, he was then eviscerated. 2 troopers from number 3 troop, Natal Native Horse, and the Zulu Guide all perished in the ensuing melee. The Prince Imperial's body was recovered the following day and sent back to England aboard HMS Orontes. In 1888, he was finally laid to rest in a specially constructed imperial crypt at St. Michael's Abbey in Farnborough. Have any of you been to this by any chance? No? Okay, cool. So his death joined a long list of disasters to befall British forces during the Anglo-Zulu War. Names such as Isandawana, Eshawi, Intombe were seared into the souls of the men who fought and survived these engagements. And now the death of the Prince Imperial. The conflict had claimed a prominent victim, with the Napoleon dynasty being brought to a violent and abrupt end. His death sent shockwaves around the world, but 2 countries felt them particularly strongly. Needless to say, France was one, the other being the United Kingdom. Following the Prince Imperial's death on the 1st of June, 1879, a series of dangerous accusations and trials soon emerged. Lieutenant Carey was found guilty during a military tribunal on the 12th of June under charges of misbehavior before the enemy. Rumors had even begun circulating in France that the British had intentionally disposed of the prince, and civil unrest was then mounting. This reached a peak when Queen Victoria was personally blamed for orchestrating the entire thing. The point is, from a British perspective, the war now needed a conclusion. The British Empire's military reputation had been tarnished abroad. The Conservative government was teetering, and large numbers of British troops had been killed or wounded, and international relations had been severely strained. Something had to be done, and fast. But before we dive into the subsequent events, I would like to rewind the clocks back to the beginning of the conflict and draw your attention to a crucial factor which contributed to the final confrontation between the British and the Zulu, and indeed the human tragedy that followed. This came in the form of Sir Garnet Wolseley. Following the defeat at Isandlwana, concerns over the conduct of Lord Chelmsford, commander of British forces in Zululand, were increasing. Predominantly, these were led by Benjamin Disraeli, the Conservative British Prime Minister. On the 12th of April 1879, Disraeli approached the Prince of Wales, a devout supporter of the two men most responsible for the war, Sir Henry Bartle Frere and Lord Chelmsford, to seek an audience. During the conversation, Disraeli said that there seemed to be a want of energy in South Africa, which was most deplorable. He went on to say, "A general of genius might put all right, but I fear he does not exist or is locked away in Cyprus." In terms of Cyprus, the Prince of Wales knew exactly who he was referring to. Sir Garnet Wolseley had been serving as a High Commissioner of Cyprus since the island was ceded to the British following the Congress of Berlin in 1878. Wolseley was recalled to London on the 21st of May to sit in on a board of general officers which was investigating the military short service system. However, in reality, this was a ploy by Disraeli and Frederick Stanley, Disraeli's war secretary, to ensure that Wolseley was available should Chelmsford be relieved of his command. However, following Chelmsford's recent military successes, it became clear that British royalty was firmly on his side. What worked in their favour, however, was an increasing lack of confidence in Chelmsford on a military level, namely from the Royal Horse Guards. By now, a damning report compiled by the Horse Guards had reached them, stating that Chelmsford had effectively lied in his official reports back to London concerning Isandlwana, and they had additional evidence to prove that he had actually lied. The previous day, to get the ball rolling, Disraeli held a cabinet meeting on the military and political situation in South Africa. He then sent a telegram to Queen Victoria, which must surely have instigated some creeping doubts about Frere and Chelmsford's conduct. And you can see the letter from Disraeli on the left side of this slide. It read, "The Cabinet is of the opinion that the civil and military commands should be rearranged. Sir Garnet Wolseley to be your Majesty's High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief for Natal, Transvaal and the territories adjacent, including Zululand, and to have within the area supreme civil and military authority under your Majesty. Sir Garnet, having the superior rank, the present Commander-in-Chief will become the second in command." Upon receiving the telegram, the Queen was startled and issued this sharp rebuke, which you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. It read, "If the Cabinet are really of opinion that the proposed arrangement in South Africa is absolutely necessary, I will not withhold my sanction, though I cannot approve. I cannot but feel that such a step will lead to the immediate resignation of both Sir Bartle Frere and Lord Chelmsford. This I would deeply deplore, as it would, in my opinion, lower this country in the eyes of all Europe, as well as encourage our enemies in South Africa. Has the Commander-in-Chief been consulted?" Whilst tensions were ruffling feathers in political, royal and military circles, Sir Garnet Wolseley was already boarding the steamer SS Edinburgh Castle bound for South Africa. It set sail on the 30th of May and would take about just over 3 weeks to reach the Cape. But those 3 weeks at sea would see another dramatic event. This became known as the Battle of Ulundi. By the 14th of June, word of Wolseley's arrival, as well as his supersession of the British military commander and proconsul, had reached the Cape. The Commander-in-Chief of British forces, Lord Chelmsford, was informed on the 17th of June. Therefore, the need for a decisive victory against the Zulu and redeeming his military reputation became paramount. Military reinforcements had arrived, and by the beginning of May, Chelmsford had a formidable army. In total, we are looking at around 17,000 men. Chelmsford concluded that Wolseley would reach the Cape by around the 23rd of June, and it would take him about 2 weeks to reach the front. He believed he could destroy the Zulu during that time. Now, for those of you who have attended my previous presentations on the Zulu War, this logic may sound scarily familiar. Meanwhile, Seswero Kamapanda, king of the Zulus, was becoming increasingly desperate to achieve a negotiated peace. On the 4th of June, Lord Chelmsford had dispatched 3 messengers to present the latest conditions to the Zulu king. This included the restoration of all British horses, oxen, arms, and ammunition that were taken by the Zulu during the course of the war, as well as the surrender of 1 or more Zulu regiments. With his kingdom and the fates of his people now hanging in the balance, Seswero was forced to persevere. Meanwhile, the SS Edinburgh Castle had finally docked in Cape Town during the evening of the 23rd of June. Wolseley then ventured to Government House, where he was met by Sir Henry Bartle-Frere, the British proconsul. Beneath the veneer of graciousness, however, Wolseley could sense that Bartle-Frere was anxious by his arrival. That night, the 2 men discussed the war. In a shameful display of diverting blame, and indeed being pretty delusional, Frere insisted that history would show that he was correct in launching his invasion of Zululand. He went on to say that the British cabinet were, I quote, weak-kneed and cowardly. Lord Chelmsford did not escape from his tirade either. Frere threw his ally under the bus by stating that Chelmsford has lost his influence and is careworn and will be very glad to be relieved. Wolseley was no fool. He was watching Frere very closely and knew that most, if not all, of what he was saying was an outright lie. Nonetheless, he was cheered by Frere's suggestion that Chelmsford was flagging and waiting to be relieved. This, however, could not have been further from the truth. Wolseley had underestimated Chelmsford's determination to fight on and to clear his name of any wrongdoing. Now, for those of you who are unsure as to what I'm referring to, Chelmsford was trying to clear his name of tactical blunders that he had committed during the war, which had forced those into political and military circles to question his conduct. This was particularly true of the British camp at Isandlwana. Due to Chelmsford's neglect, the camp was overrun by at least 20,000 Zulu warriors, which had led to the deaths of 1,387 British soldiers. It was one of the worst disasters to befall the British Army in the Victorian era. On the 25th of June, Seswero sent envoys to the British, begging them to halt the advance to allow negotiations to take place. If the march on the Zulu capital continued, Seswero's army would be forced to fight. In no uncertain terms, he said, "I will have no option but to resist, as there will be nothing left but to try and push aside a tree that is falling upon me." A day later, Colonel Evelyn Wood's flying column descended into the valley that you see before you to destroy Zulu homesteads. However, they came across something of great importance to the Zulu. This valley was home to the ancestors of the Zulu royal house, which housed an item of spiritual importance. The Inkatha was an object of great spiritual potency to the Zulu. It was said to bind the Zulu Kingdom together. Physically, it was a circular coil of braided grass measuring about 1 meter across and as thick as a man's leg below the knee. Bound into this coil were items which had been collected since the time of Shaka, the founding father of the Zulu nation. In essence, it represented a collective intimacy of people long since deceased. The coil was encased in python skin. The British, of course, were not aware of its significance, but when these homesteads were burnt, the Inkatha included, this was to bring about bad omens for the Zulu. In effect, the burning of the Inkatha represented the destruction of future unity for the Zulu Kingdom. Ironically, if this spiritual artifact had been captured by the British, from a Zulu perspective, this also meant that the Zulu Kingdom were now subjects to the British. Seshweo was not aware of its destruction for some time, and he continued to seek peace terms. On the 27th of June, his envoys found Chelmsford's new camp, which was now a mere 17 miles from the Zulu capital. Aside from a letter from Seshweo, the envoys brought 2 huge elephant tusks and 150 oxen. However, Chelmsford's reply was tragically brief. On the 30th of June, Zulu envoys made a penultimate attempt for peace. A final letter was handed to Chelmsford from Seshweo, and the envoys presented the sword of the Prince Imperial and promised yet more cattle. However, yet again, the Zulu fell afoul of a villainous underhand. Cornelius Vine, a Dutch trader who had been captured by the Zulu and served as Seshweo's advisor, was called upon to translate every letter Seshweo would send to Chelmsford. Unbeknownst to the Zulu envoys, the young Dutch boy had added his own modification to Seshweo's original letter. It stated that the Zulu intended to fight. Exactly, that's it all. So this played right into Chelmsford's hands. If he kept stalling the Zulu with preconditions, the Zulu army would not intercept him for fear of retribution. This would allow him to advance further into their territory unmolested. In the early hours of the 1st of July, British troops began moving into their final camp just short of the Zulu capital. These troops were protected by a double wagon laager, so in essence, a circular kind of fortification with carts, that type of thing, and a small stone fort. Across the White Anglo-Zulu River, which is basically, oh, I've got to get this right, which is just these rivers down here, predominantly, they could see the Zulu. They were keeping their distance, but ensuring that the British did not cross the river. On that same day, Seshweo made a final attempt for peace. He sent the order for a herd of royal white oxen to be sent across the river to the British camp as a peace offering. But the young warriors of the Umsijo regiment, who were guarding the fords across the river, intercepted the cattle and then turned them away. They were disgusted that their king would keep pandering to an enemy who had never kept to their word and were the clear aggressors invading their homeland. Later that day, Seshweo was also in a state of despair. Whilst addressing his regiments at Ulundi, Seshweo felt compelled to criticize the Umsijo for their callous and unauthorized decision. Fully aware that the military might of the British Empire was about to descend upon them, he knew that the British would win the type of pitched battle that was looming. If they lost, he and the kingdom under him would be at the mercy of the British. Unwilling to take the blame, they responded in kind by stating that the British were the aggressors and that they would defend him and the Zulu Kingdom to the last. Cetshwayo knew that this would likely be a one-sided battle, but he also knew that his warriors were absolutely determined to fight. All he could do was offer some parting advice. The first was that his warriors should avoid attacking entrenched British positions, and the second was, should they be successful in defeating the British in the open, they should halt their pursuit of any stragglers as they would be in range of the British field guns on the other side of the river. At daybreak on the 3rd of July, Zulu marksmen had positioned themselves on the bluffs to the northeast of the British camp. They began targeting water parties as well as the troops in the laager itself. Any British troops by the river retreated and fell back to the camp. They waited and they gave the Zulu time to fire. This was then met by the British response. At noon, artillery batteries then opened fire. That's the best I could do in terms of an artillery battery, I'm sorry to say. As shells rained down on the bluffs and the dense foliage where the marksmen were hiding, this was a very clear message. Noon on the 3rd of July marked the deadline for Zulu compliance with Chelmsford's conditions for peace with firepower. He also herded the cattle he had received from Cetshwayo back across the river. This was a symbolic end to the truce. An hour had passed, and with it, so had the artillery barrage. The barrage lifted, and the guns fell silent. Rushing forward, 2 cavalry units prepared to encircle any surviving Zulu snipers. The northern troop, marked by the red line, was commanded by Commandant Baker of the Natal Native Horse. The other, marked by the green line, was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Reivers Buller. In Buller's case, the cavalry forded the river lower down and then shifted northwards. The pincer move caught the Zulu by surprise, with any survivors fleeing back to the capital. Buller followed the retreating Zulu, hoping to recon a possible battle site going forward. His mounted troops soon came across a dense patch of long grass directly across their path. Buller stopped his troop, sensing that something was wrong, and his intuition proved absolutely correct. Hiding within the grass were 4,000 warriors belonging to the Inlong-Yengwi, under the command of this man, Zebebu. And we will come back to his story a little later. It was fortuitous that Buller chose to stop because the Zulu had actually prepared an intricate trap. Across the length and the breadth of this area, the Zulu had woven braids of grass which would be used to trip horses and men. Once the riders were forcibly dismounted, the Zulu would then rush them. However, the Zulu could not wait any longer. Volley fire suddenly erupted from the grass. 3 cavalrymen were killed instantly. Others were trapped when their horses fell from under them. Lord William Beresford, who was part of Buller's unit, saw that one of his troops was pinned beneath a dead horse. Unwilling to leave the man there, Beresford dismounted his horse to assist. Realizing the danger, Buller ordered his men to turn around and fire a volley into the long grass. This kept the Zulu suppressed long enough for the soldier to be retrieved and for the unit to flee. But after extricating the survivors, Buller returned to Chelmsford with vital tactical intelligence. As darkness fell, the Zulu advanced to the riverside and they began singing war songs to intimidate the British and to keep them all awake. At 4 a.m. on July the 4th, the troops were silently roused, had breakfast, and were then assembled to cross the river at the lower drift, where Buller had crossed the day before. This was now secured by Buller's troops, which enabled the main army to cross unhindered. In total, we are looking at a main force of around about 4,166 troops, 958 local auxiliaries, 12 field guns, and 2 Gatling guns. Once across the river, the main force formed up into a huge hollow square, which looked something like this. The infantry formed 4 ranks deep, with guns, ammunition, and carts in the centre. On all sides, the cavalry formed a protective screen. Lessons had been learnt. It was essentially a formidable and mobile defensive perimeter. Zulus were spotted along the route of advance, but generally, the British force was actually left unmolested. And what the Zulu? What were the British facing on that fateful day? Exact numbers are pretty difficult to ascertain, to be honest with you, and these figures are often disputed. The best I can offer you is an account from Cetshwayo himself. After the war, Cetshwayo was interviewed, where he stated that a similar number had fought at Isandlwana. In other words, we're looking at around 20,000 warriors, and there was an extra 5,000 in reserve, although the reserve was never actually deployed during this battle. Cetshwayo himself was not leading the army either. He had withdrawn to his family kraal, which was located 2 miles to the east of the battlefield. As the British advanced, Zulu military settlements were torched. Much like flicking a switch, this was a signal for the Zulu to attack. George Turnham of the 17th Lancers gave this account of what happened next. We set fire to one of the kraals, and this seemed to be a signal for the beginning of the fight. No sooner did the Zulus see smoke than they came running out of cover like a swarm of bees and completely round us. The front and rear faces of the square parted to allow the cavalry through. Once they were clear and they were safely inside, the walls then closed behind them. The Battle of Ulundi had begun. It was just after 9 a.m. As the Zulu advanced, the British lines readied themselves. Then came the thunderous boom of field guns firing simultaneously. Just to show how much they were surrounded, just to add to that. The results were absolutely devastating. Bodies and parts of bodies were flung into the air. And yet amongst this ghastly mess, the Zulu kept advancing. As the Zulu army completed its envelopment of the British square, the infantry were ready to fire. Corporal William Rowe of the 58th Regiment of Foot recalled, "The fire opened from the artillery at a long range and did fearful execution, for we could see their heads, legs, and arms flying in the air. In all directions, on they came, till they were within range of our rifles. Our 2 front ranks kneeling and our 2 rear ranks standing. And when they reached the range of our rifles, we opened a fearful fire on them. They were falling down in heaps, as though they had been tipped out of carts." The Zulus returned fire, and although it was generally inaccurate, it is unsurprising that some British soldiers were hit, considering they were in a tightly packed square. The battlefield was now covered in dense smoke and dust. At closer range, the constant rattle of the Gatling guns rang out, accounting for even more Zulu casualties. The Zulu simply could not break through this wall of fire. Most warriors got to within 30 yards of the British line, but no less. Through the swirling smoke, the Zulu attack was pressed again, but after a short while, it momentarily stopped and began to falter. As the Zulu retreated, the British began to cheer, although for some of these troops, this cheer was actually answered with a sharp and deadly response from the Zulu. For example, Corporal Tompkinson of the 58th Regiment began to cheer, only for a bullet to pass straight through his open mouth. Many British veterans observed that the Zulu did not seem to fight as hard as they had on previous battles. This observation was backed up when prominent Zulu commanders were interviewed after the war. They said the army was broken during the Battle of Kambula, and they did not fight with the same zeal. Kambula, by the way, fought on the 29th of March 1879, was a decisive British victory, which saw around about 2,000 Zulu killed. The Battle of Ulundi was seeing the destruction and rout of numerous Zulu regiments who had made their name in previous battles. The Umbonam, the Kenki, the Ingoba Makos, the Utulwan, all were being cut down as they retreated. In total, 1,500 Zulu were killed at this stage of the battle, but it was far from over. Amongst the Zulu killed during this initial phase were the Prince Imperial's assailants. In British eyes, he had been avenged. British casualties were 3 officers and 10 men killed, with a further officer and 69 men wounded. With the Zulu army routed, Chelmsford advanced a whole force to the banks of a stream just short of the Zulu capital. From there, Buller's cavalry were ordered to pass through to Ulundi and burn it to the ground. In moments of elation, this prompted mounted officers to vie for the honour of reaching the Zulu capital first. This race was actually run by Lord William Beresford. Unfortunately, as with any race, there is also a loser, or in this case, a dead loser. This came in the form of the Honourable William Drummond, who was ambushed and killed by a group of fleeing Zulu. Nonetheless, the advance was a massacre. Any Zulu that were found were cut down in vast swathes. Unarmed, they made for easy pickings for the cavalry. It has been estimated that another 500 Zulu were killed during this time. Buller's men ransacked the homesteads, killing anyone who crossed their path. The destruction of the Zulu Kingdom was finalized when Buller's men took torches to every building in sight. Corporal Rowe from the 58th Regiment recalled, "In a very short time, the whole of the King's city, Ulundi, was in flames. This was a fearful sight to see. You would think the whole world was on fire when there was dense mass of flames 7 miles in length. There were 7,095 kraals burnt to the ground. The king's kraal was in the center of a large circle. This circle was 5 miles round it, and all the kraals were made up of sticks and plaited straw, or at least grass, which are in the shape of a beehive. But the king's big kraal was built in the shape of a proper house with a thatched roof. Chelmsford was over the moon with this victory. He had defeated the Zulu, and he hoped have restored his military reputation before the politicians could drag him through the mud back home. As far as he was concerned, the Battle of Isandlwana and all of its surrounding controversies had disappeared amongst the fire and smoke engulfing Ulundi. He congratulated and paraded men. The band of the 1st Battalion, 13th Regiment, played Rule Britannia and God Save the Queen before the entire force retraced its steps back towards the camp. With his victory telegram completed and stowed, Chelmsford withdrew his forces. Meanwhile, Seshweo was informed of the defeat at Ulundi that same evening by lookouts who had been watching the entire thing from nearby hills. He now had to avoid being captured by the British. During his escape, members of the Msijo Regiment, the same men who he had criticised a couple of days beforehand, were now at his side again, wishing to protect him. However, Seshweo was forced to send them away. Large groups are easy to spot, smaller groups, not so much. Escorted by a few women and his servants, he went into hiding. Incredibly, he still tried to negotiate with the British, but this would be in vain. Meanwhile, Wolseley was unaware of the battle, and wishing to keep Chelmsford on a tight leash, he was demanding regular reports. Chelmsford ignored all of these instructions. The reason being, he wanted to get his story out first, before anyone could actually dispute it. When Wolseley finally reached the British camp near the front, he was greeted with a message from Chelmsford stating that he was resigning his command on the grounds that, I quote, "I have done a considerable amount of work over the past 18 months. I hope that this request will be favourably received." Even though Wolseley was forced to congratulate Chelmsford, deep down he was absolutely furious. The British commander was returning home as a hero, whilst Wolseley was left to clear up the mess left in his wake. Although it does need to be stressed that Wolseley would soon become directly responsible for making matters far worse. On the 8th of July, Wolseley met with John Donne, a diplomat originating from Durban. He was aware that Donne was a manipulative character who was always looking to exploit opportunities for trade with some pretty underhanded tactics, it does need to be said. Nonetheless, he was forced to work with him. He was a recognised power in South Africa, and Wolseley intended to use him for maintaining control of areas, including the now disbanded Zululand. Wolseley considered it necessary for the safety of Natal to divide Zululand into several self-governing districts, with Duns being the biggest and the most important. He was then instructed by the Colonial Office to divide Zululand into 13 districts and appoint a chief to each, who were overseen by a British resident. This thought process, however, was to bring about a catastrophe of epic proportions. On the 19th of July, Wolseley addressed a delegation of around 250 Zulu chiefs, where he laid out his plans for the division of Zululand. In his personal diary, Wolseley would write this absolutely chilling entry, and hopefully you will agree with me on this. So he put, "Perhaps I am brutal, but I think it important to punish these northern tribes severely as a warning to all others in South Africa as to what they may expect should they ever be fools enough to consider waging war on the English. Up to the present, beyond shooting and wounding 10,000 men, where's that come from? We have not punished the people as a nation, yeah, right, and our leniency in now allowing all the people to return to their kraals, retaining all of their cattle, may possibly be mistaken for fear. I should like to let loose the Swazis upon these northern tribes at once, but I have to think of the howling societies at home who have sympathy with all black men." His next task was locating the Zulu king. To discourage the Zulu from hiding him, Wolseley immediately went back on his word, ordering the troops to burn kraals and loot any livestock. They were also given authority to engage in torture to gain information. Under mounting pressure, Minyama, one of the king's closest friends, would betray him to the British. Seshwaro had been discovered in the Ngomi forest, which lies approximately 57 miles from Ulundi. On the 28th of August, Seshwaro was tracked down and captured. Major Richard Martyr of the 1st Dragoon Guards led one of 2 patrols into the forest. He caught Seshwaro completely by surprise. Martyr would treat the king with comparative dignity, providing ample food and shelter, as well as posting guards to ensure that no harm was done to him, namely by British troops. On the 31st of August, Seshwaro was brought back to Wolseley's camp overlooking the still smouldering remains of Ulundi. In an incredible display of grace and dignity, Seshwaro walked in there looking like a true warrior. He did not bow his head, nor did he shrink in the face of his enemy. He stood proud and he stood tall. However, Wolseley's arrogance would shine through. Not to be outdone, he declined to meet Seshwaro, Instead, he made sure that the Zulu king received a letter saying that he was now a prisoner of the British and he would remain so. At that moment, Ceshuao was seen to visibly crumble. On the 1st of September 1879, it was a brutally hot day, and I want you to think of this as a metaphor for the events to follow. 200 senior Zulu dignitaries and chiefs were summoned to the British headquarters at Ulundi. Interpreting for them was John Shepstone, whose brother was actually killed at Isandlwana. The Zulu were informed that Ceshuao had been captured and exiled. They were then told that Zululand would be divided into 13 independent chiefdoms, with each chief being selected and personally appointed by the British. If this sounds like a bad idea to you, you'd be absolutely correct. This was never going to end well. The appointed chiefs were deliberately selected from those who had fought on the side of the British, or they had deserted Ceshuao prior to his arrest. This was intended to create political disharmony, rivalries, and increase existing tensions. In essence, the British were wanting to destroy Zululand from within. They also knew that senior Zulu generals who had fought for Ceshuao during the war would be immediately targeted, thus destroying any threats of future uprisings. Little did they realize. This division inevitably led to further bloodshed. The Pedi tribe, whose domain bordered northern Zululand, was a large and powerful independent African kingdom. It had always been fiercely opposed to European settlement, but it was also pragmatic enough to take advantage of the economic benefits it offered. This came following the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in the 1860s, making them a powerful economic enemy to the British. In response, the British called upon the Swazis, who had a long-standing grievance with the Pedi. Backed by British troops, the Swazi met the Pedi in battle in November 1879, with the Swazi emerging victorious. Another major thorn had been removed from the British side. However, following Wolseley's harsh treatment of the Zulu by creating division, many Zulu then began objecting to the chiefs being imposed upon them from different tribes. And now, attempting to stem the flow, albeit far too late, Wolseley told the Boundaries Commission that the Zulu were free to move to another chief's territory. I mean, talk about missing the obvious points. What Wolseley had failed to understand, or chose to ignore, is that the Zulu were physically and spiritually bonded to the places where they were born. And it was the areas where their ancestors farmed and had raised families of their own. For these reasons, they were never going to adhere to European attempts at political or economic manipulation. The Boundary Commissioners realized very quickly the serious trouble was brewing. They reported back to Wolseley that the chiefs, particularly James Dunn, were unsuitable for their roles and that the partition should be reconsidered. Wolseley discarded that element of the report, although he must have realized that the British had now lost control. One chief who was proving particularly problematic for the British was our old friend Zebebu. He had proven to be a devious and manipulative character. Despite having forged a distinguished career during the Anglo-Zulu War, his lust for power was becoming far too great. During the partition of Zululand, he was placed in charge of a district. Zebebu's appointment, as well as the eventual British victory over the Zulu, had actually exposed a dangerous and hidden sting in the tail. Unbeknownst to the British, the Zulu victories early in the war had shown the chinks in their armour. Other parties, most notably the Boer, had begun to sit up and take notice. With open rebellion against British rule now looming, Zebebu had opened negotiations with the Boer. In other words, the enemy of my enemy is now my friend. Realizing that they had lost control, the colonial authorities in South Africa and London began to panic. Reports were flooding back saying that there was widespread civil unrest in Zululand and it was likely to escalate if left unresolved. This reached the highest levels of British society. It was in this moment that they turned to the very man that they actually sought to overthrow to begin with. Although Queen Victoria was wary of interfering with her government, she urged from her ministers to reconsider repatriating Cetshwayo to restore order. His return to Zululand was delayed, but only because the colonial administrators needed more time to reduce an area that Cetshwayo could control. The British were justifiably worried about the Boer, but were also quietly counting on his return, bringing further unrest. Cetshwayo was reinstated as King of the Zulus in February 1883. It was then decided that Zululand would be divided into 3 sectors. The northern part was controlled by Zimbabwe, the centre by Cetshwayo, and the southern end was reserved for Zulus who did not want to be ruled by either. And then on top of that, you then had the British in Natal. Cetshwayo and his followers were now effectively sandwiched between his enemies in the north, as well as British Natal in the south. Again, this was never going to end well. Cetshwayo sought help from the British, who unsurprisingly declined. With Zimbabwe attacking any Zulu that he thought was loyal to Cetshwayo, it was inevitable that this was going to be met with a military response. Zimbabwe, Cetshwayo's one-time cousin, it does need to be said, was now his mortal enemy. On the 21st of July, battle was joined. Warriors loyal to the king, consisting of an army of around 5,000, engaged Zimbabwe's army, who were backed by Boer commandos. Zimbabwe's army retreated, but this was a tactical maneuver, nothing more than a feint. His army got behind Cetshwayo's and annihilated them. Amongst the dead were Inchimwayo, the general who had led Zulu forces at Isandlwana and Kambula. Cetshwayo fled to Ashawi, where on the 17th of October, he sought the protection of the British resident commissioner. King Cetshwayo would die following a meal on the 8th of February, 1884. Now, this is highly suspicious because considering on that same day, he was seen walking around and he appeared in pretty good health. Most likely, he was actually poisoned by his own people. Zulus were familiar with various poisons that could be incorporated into beers and snuffs, both of which the king liked. Suspicions of foul play were increased when the Zulu did not raise the alarm for 4 hours, and they also denied a British doctor the opportunity to examine the body and perform a post-mortem. The Zulu king, who has seen and endured so much hardship during his reign, was buried in a beautiful part of the Nkandla forest, close to the Moma Gorge. Cetshwayo's heir, Prince Dinizulu, would go on to inherit a country in absolute ruins, one that was ravaged by civil war and an economy that was absolutely devastated by war with the British. Even though the British were disinterested in the human tragedy unfolding before them, they certainly didn't escape from this completely unscathed. Rather fittingly, Wolseley was lambasted. The British public and politicians openly attacked his conduct in South Africa. It was a very public humiliation for a man who up to that point was the darling of the British military. That being said, he would still go on to gain many awards, including a seat in the Council of India in November 1876, and he became High Commissioner of Cyprus on the 12th of July 1878. With Zimbabwe's army having achieved their victory with the assistance of Boer commandos, the British looked on with great concern. Boer influence in South Africa was increasing. Although their motivations were also driven by self-interest and expansion, they were for now providing military assistance and finances to chiefdoms in Zululand. With Seswero dead, Zebebu and Chief Hamu, two prominent leaders in the northern sector of Zululand, began a systematic dismantling of the old order. However, something dramatic then occurred. No, hang on, I went too far. In a last-ditch attempt to retain the Zulu royal house, some of Seswero's followers severed relations with the British and sought help from the Boer. The Boer granted Prince Dinizulu a safe sanctuary in Boer territory, like the Transvaal, and on the 21st of May 1883, pronounced him King of the Zulus. The result was absolutely incredible. Those that sought refuge from Zebebu now came out of hiding and offered allegiance to their new king. Backed by Boer guns, Zebebu's army received absolutely no mercy. Their violent and devious leader was forced to flee, passing away in 1904. Sadly, this newfound freedom came at a particularly heavy price. The Boer now demanded a vast swathe of Zululand in payment, including the disputed territories which had been so bitterly fought over prior to the Anglo-Zulu War. The Zulu were now sandwiched again between two aggressive white powers. And what are the memorials to the brave men who fought on both sides of this battle? If you are able to visit the battlefield, you will see this impressive monument that marks the site of the British Square, which now lies adjacent to the northern tip of Ulundi airfield. When looking at this conflict in hindsight, it is extremely difficult, obviously, to find any positives. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 achieved absolutely nothing. It dispelled notions, if anything, of British invincibility. It saw the toppling of a British government. It caused a prominent European dynasty to fall, and it caused untold misery to subjugated people. Not only that, but the various monuments that you see on the battlefields to this day are testament to the pointless human loss. Britain and her allies would lose 1,902 men killed in this war. Another 268 were wounded. On the Zulu side, 6,930 were killed, whilst over 3,500 were wounded. Benjamin Disraeli, the Conservative Prime Minister, summed this up perfectly. He once said, "A very remarkable people, the Zulus. They defeat our generals, they convert our bishops, they have settled the fate of a great European dynasty." And the torments and hardships for the Zulu, of which there are too many to mention tonight, would continue until 1975. But obviously, let's try and end this on a positive note if we can. Let me introduce you to Prince Buthelezi. He was a South African politician and Zulu prince who served as the Prime Minister of the Zulu Royal House from 1954 until his death in 2023. He was one of the most prominent black politicians of the apartheid era and consistently lobbied for the release of Nelson Mandela. As a point in fact, he appeared in the 1964 film Zulu, playing the role of his real great-grandfather, King Seswero. And in 1975, inspired by previous rulers who had focused on Zulu unity in the face of outside intimidation, Prime Minister Buthelezi founded the Inkatha Freedom Party. Due to his efforts, and others like him, after 76 years of vicious turmoil and tensions, Zululand was once again ruled by its own leaders. It was an unprecedented move that gave international support. After enduring years of European attempts to convert the Zulu people to Christianity, to force them to adopt modernization or to impose socialization, the Zulu prevailed. It really is, I feel, an incredible demonstration of their resilience and their determination. And to this day, rural Zulus have gone on to live in their timeless way. And finally, I would like to thank all of you, whether in person or online, for attending my talk tonight. It is great to see that even after 146 years, the Anglo-Zulu War and its aftermath still generates enough interest for you to have attended this lecture. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Mike. An awful lot there that I certainly didn't know anything about, and fascinating story. Okay, any questions we have? Anyone want to start us off? Great. Can you speak into the microphone?
Oh, sorry. It does seem rather extraordinary that a British patrol would go out in such small numbers and not have sentries posted.
Yes.
It's just the, it's criminal, isn't it?
It is. And just to add to that, I mean, this is where Louis Napoleon actually comes into that story, because he was quite a brash character, I think is probably the best way to say it. He wanted to kind of prove his mirth militarily, and he was there saying, let's just go for it, nothing's going to happen, and of course it did. So he did play a part in that, and it was against a lot of British kind of things at the time, because they were there saying, we need to protect this guy. And he was there like, no, I'll just go off and do it. And that's what happened. So, but yes, you're absolutely right. A bit of an oversight, fatal oversight.
Okay, any more? Okay, I'll start with you, then come to you.
When did they realise that the Dutch interpreter had interpreted the thing incorrectly?
That was until after the war, unfortunately. Yeah. So nobody knew up to that point. It was only when they got the Zulu back together in meetings that they realised that they were there like, well, that's not what he put on the letter. And yeah, as I said, it was very much an underhanded tactic.
So when was that, like, quite?
I mean, if memory serves, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but it was around about August, September time when they found out. So easily 2 months after.
Right, thank you.
Hello. Yeah, thanks, Mike. That was really, really interesting. Again, brilliant. I missed the first one, so I wonder if you could say a little bit about Britain's motivation for attacking the Zulus in the first place.
Sure.
And then, I guess, whether that was then kind of realised afterwards, whether kind of what happened, did British people settle there, or did they achieve what they wanted to do?
Sure. So just to backtrack a little bit. So Lord Carnarvon, he gave Sir Bartle Frere, in essence, carte blanche to try and confederate South Africa. So this is a means of getting all of the disparate nations to fall under British command, including, or control, including Zululand. So that is what prompted the initial kind of incursion into South Africa. And as a means of kind of forcing the hand a little bit, the British were then deployed British military was then deployed on the border of Zululand. They were then given an ultimatum saying, and it was all trumped up. It was trumped up charges of aggression and other such things. I'm sure we've all heard this before in some way. When the Zulu didn't comply, because obviously they didn't do anything wrong, they then went across the border anyway. And then that led to the Battle of Isandlwana in a nutshell. But yeah, in essence, it's a means of confederating South Africa in British control. What you've got to bear in mind is that other countries were also interested. So you had Germany, you had Belgium, you had all of those guys, all of those countries. They were obviously wanting a hand in the economic benefits of South Africa as well. So it's very much them trying to gain as much control as they can very quickly. Yeah.
Okay, this is from the online audience. It follows on from that rather nicely, actually. Paraphrasing, if the British had not fought the Zulu but had come to some kind of accommodation, might that have had an impact on the subsequent Boer War, which I think was, 20 odd years later, wasn't it?
That's a good question. I mean, I think, firstly, to address the situation in terms of the Zulus, I don't think the British were ever going to allow a powerful organized military organization like the Zulu to exist. That's probably accurate. In terms of the Boer, if they had not done that, quite possibly. I mean, it's one of those many what ifs, isn't it, that come about as a result of history. It's difficult to gauge, but quite possibly, yeah.
Okay, anyone else in the room? Okay, I'll ask you one question that for myself, which, because I know we were talking earlier, you've got an interesting theory about the Zulu battle tactics, the famous impi, that it's sort of, the idea of skirmishers going forwards, throwing their spears, and then having the sort of double flanking attack, which sort of seems reminiscent of Roman tactics. Is that? I mean, there's no possibilities there that sort of tactical knowledge could have passed down from North Africa or through the continent?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a good question. So just at a time of what me and Joe were discussing a little bit earlier, the tactics that the Zulu used were incredibly similar to those adopted by the Roman army. Even down to, as Joe pointed out, them throwing spears at the beginning of the battle, closing with the enemy, outflanking the enemy in the horns of the buffalo, as we know, if you've ever seen Zulu. Very, very similar tactics. I mean, they're not new tactics. They were done before, but what you've got to bear in mind is that the Zulu were on foot. They were not on horses. And these flanking maneuvers, they were easily 5 miles apart. So amazing feats of actually getting these men moving. Now, when it came to your question, it's quite possible. It's quite possible. I mean, all through recently in particular, there's been a number of books where they've strongly suggested that various types of ideas were passed around in various countries, particularly transport links. So it's entirely possible. But yeah, I mean, as I said, the tactics are so similar that it's difficult not to draw that comparison. They're very, very similar. And I do recommend any of you looking up about that because it is fascinating.
Okay, so thanks. Unless there's anything, we have one more. Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Really interesting. Just 2 questions, please. Will you be repeating all of your talks again? Because I missed the first 2, unfortunately. And also, during this time, during the wars, what were the other tribes, like the Xhosa and the Vendi, etc.? What were they involved, or were they, because they weren't fighting people, were they not involved? Or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of the talks, that was up to Joe.
Just on the first point, all our talks are on our YouTube channel, which is the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, and you can see Mike's 2 previous talks on there, and they're worth watching.
Yeah, and in terms of your second question, absolutely. I mean, there was still a lot of infighting going on between these other tribes as well, particularly certain tribes. But where the Zulu are maybe slightly different, much like the Pedi, much like the Swazis, they were very adept at taking on survivors of a tribe and incorporating them into their ranks. Others were far more peaceful, and they were a lot more nomadic. So it certainly in no way was universal. But obviously when you're looking at an organized system like the Zulu, absolutely. They were very, very aggressive in terms of what they were doing to other tribes. Yeah. I hope that answers that. Cool.
Okay, I think we'll have to call a halt there to allow the staff to lock up the building. So I'd hope you join me in a final round of applause to thank Mike Nicholas for a great talk.